Evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Astor Imaging channel. Unfortunately, Adam couldn't be here tonight, so I'll be hosting tonight. We don't have an image of the week this week, so we'll go straight into the presentation, which is going to be Josh talking about selecting targets, how he stores data and stuff like this. So, Josh, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, David. All right, let me share my screen here and make sure that we have everything going. I wanted to start off by thanking Alex for having me out to RTMC last week, which was just a awesome event, awesome location. Being the East Coast guy, I've never been out there, so it was a lot of fun to be out there and kind of explore the area. The people who attended were great. We had a really good time, and so we're going to bring you a little bit of what we did out at RTMC with this presentation and talk a little bit about what I presented out there. And it's going to be a pretty short and sweet episode tonight. So if you have any questions, feel free to hop in with them. And then we can do a little open chat at the end. So going into tonight, I'm going to hop right into kind of the middle of the presentation from the other day. David or Alex, if any questions come in, please let me know. We're going to talk about acquiring your data through target selection, and then we can do equipment selection briefly, but then also get into data organization as well. So I kind of divide acquiring your data into three different parts. One is selecting your targets, thinking about how to select your targets, when and what targets you want to do. And then I like to follow up after that by talking a little bit about what equipment you want to use for those. And then finally, what do we do with that data once we get it so that you can actually access it later on. So whenever I start off by talking about target selection, I think a little bit about the equipment that I actually have, because the equipment I have is going to sort of guide me towards what targets I can actually acquire, or I can think about it the other way, where I think about what targets I want to actually shoot and then pick my equipment based on that. When I look for targets, I look in a handful of different ways, and we'll go over those in just a little bit. More recently, I kind of hop back and forth a little bit between very rare targets and much more popular targets. You can see that the backdrop of this presentation is M42, which probably everybody has shot, and shot maybe multiple times. And then I also, go after stuff that I think nobody's ever shot, or dynamic events, stuff like supernova, comets, asteroids, and things that just are not as commonly shown. So going into actually selecting your targets, the first thing that I recommend, anybody who follows us probably is a member of some of these communities, but if you're not, then I definitely highly recommend being a member of Cloudy Nights or Astor. When you're there, you're going to see a lot of seasonal targets come up, and it's really a great way to see what's in the sky. And a lot of times now that the popularity has grown so much in Cloudy Nights and or Astor, also APOD and the new double APOD, which is for amateurs only, you're going to see a lot more targets that are kind of lined up with the season. So if you see an APOD or double APOD, it was likely shot recently. It's not always the case, but a lot of times it's the case. One that is probably more of a new program that has not been around quite as long as Deep Sky Object Browser. Deep Sky Object Browser is great because you can put in a lot of kind of restraints about what you want out of the target, and it will kind of give you a long list of what you're looking for. So you might say that you want your target to be above a certain altitude. You might say that you want it to be having the moon only be a certain brightness. You might pick it out by saying, I want it to be a certain size, at least 20 minutes by 20 minutes large, or maybe even a degree by a degree. Then your selection will get a little bit smaller, but it's something that's grown a lot in popularity recently. I don't know that it is integrated yet with Sequence Generator Pro, but I've heard that they're working on getting it integrated with Sequence Generator Pro. So it's something where, if you're really kind of just wondering what you're going to shoot next, it's really a great program to kind of get into that. So when I am selecting my targets, I'm going to go through a handful of things that I kind of think about and how I think about them, and then we'll move on from there. But one of the number one things is first, and everybody knows this, kind of obvious, is when is the moon up? How bright is it? Just because the moon is up tonight doesn't mean that you necessarily need to say, well, I can't shoot anything great. Most of the nights the moon is up, except for a small handful in the middle of, a full moon. You're going to get part of the night with no moonlight at all. So when you're planning your sequence or planning what you're going to acquire, look at when the moon is actually up. At the beginning of the night or the end of the night, you might get 2, 3, maybe 4 hours where the moon's not up at all, and you can go after something much more like a broadband target or a faint target. And other times, if the moon is up, maybe it's only a 20% moon or a 30% moon. You can think about it that way too. You might be able to shoot broadband that is 40 degrees away from the moon. Maybe the moon is coming up right over the horizon. You can start right at the meridian with the target and get plenty of distance where you can get some really good data. And then also think about what filter you want to use based on that moon. So if the moon is probably 50% or anything larger than that, it's going to be pretty bright in the sky. It's going to be a struggle to get broadband data. Maybe that's where you want to think about going to narrowband and possibly even only hydrogen alpha. If it's a little bit smaller and you can get a little bit of separation from the moon, maybe go with oxygen or maybe go with S2. And then, so moving on, if you take the moon out of the equation, think about where the target actually, or when the target actually transits the meridian. So, if you are shooting a galaxy, you might want to get your color while it's down low, and you might want to get your luminance while it's up high. I think that one of the #1 things to getting a better picture and more details in your picture is shooting your luminance up high in the sky. So, if there's no moon at all and you've got 8 hours to shoot your target, think about shooting, maybe 3 or 4 hours of color. Shoot 2 hours of color as it's coming up, and then maybe 4 hours of luminance as it's going across the meridian, and then another 2 hours of color as it's going down. Not only that, but maybe think about rotating through your color. So when you're taking an image and you're shooting your color data, if you are going red, 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 and then green, 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 blue, 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 you're going to get a difference in noise. I mean, inherently, you're going to get a little difference in noise because the sensor that you're using is likely a little bit more or less sensitive in different parts of the broadband spectrum. However, if you rotate through, you're likely going to get a much smoother and better looking image. And by saying rotate through, I mean shoot red, green, blue, red, green, blue. If there's no moon, you might want to consider shooting something like a LRGB sequence, or even like an LL or LLL RGB sequence. Doing that just helps kind of, like I said, it helps keep the noise profile of each color a little more similar. What you don't want to end up with, there's multiple things you could end up with. One is you don't want to end up shooting, your blue down low in the sky and then your red up high in the sky, and they get something where your blue is super, super noisy and your red looks great. That typically stands out a lot in an image, especially once you start trying to stretch it a lot. So rotating through your sequence is a good way to go. And like I said, optimally, I would shoot something like maybe RGB on a night where the seeing is not great. So going on to the next point, what is the seeing like tonight? If your seeing is looking like it's going to be mediocre for the night or poor for the night, maybe just consider collecting color data. Not everyone likes to collect tons and tons of data for an image. Some people like to just get, a handful of hours and they're done. If you're somebody who's willing to put in a little bit more time, definitely consider shooting your color channels on a night where the seeing is not quite as good, and then wait maybe a little bit for a steady night to get more details. And in my experience, dark skies definitely help. Having the moon down definitely helps to get luminance. But one thing on some of those galaxies and smaller galaxies is that shooting luminance whenever the skies are steady makes a huge, huge difference. You can combine your color and your luminance into something like a synthetic luminance or a super lume, but you cannot make up for details whenever the seeing is not very good. So if the seeing's not great or it's really bad, I often recommend just skip luminance altogether. Come back to that at another time. You might get 1 hour of steady skies that is worth 8 hours of skies where the seeing is not as good. So when you're thinking about, how you want to actually collect your data, think about how much data you want in each channel. You can do that by looking on some of those websites that we talked about before, and kind of look at what people with comparable setups actually have put into their images and get an idea of how bright or how faint that image is. Sometimes you'll get a magnitude of the target. The magnitude can help, but a lot of times just talking to the people or looking at the amount of data they have actually collected is a big help. Something where you're shooting like M106 or M51, it's pretty bright. You're not necessarily going to need a ton of data, maybe M81 or M82. But once you get beyond that, first 10 or 20 really popular targets, there's still a lot of bright targets, and maybe they're a little bit smaller. And seeing what people have done on them and talking to people about, how much data they had to collect, how quickly it started showing itself makes a huge difference. I can go back to some other targets that are a little bit fainter, like interacting galaxies, like our pretzel galaxies that we did last year. The cores of those galaxies were really bright, and they came out immediately. But then when you wanted to go on to actually getting the tidal tails on them, it took a ton of data to get that really clean. And that's something, that you just don't know until you start collecting it. And sometimes you're not going to know until you're a night or two into the data and actually stacking it and looking at it. So, I definitely highly recommend checking out those sites and talking to people more once you get beyond the handful of really bright targets. Another thing that I like to think about when thinking about how to select my target or acquire it is, how do you want to actually frame the target? And this is, I think, maybe one of the most overlooked aspects of imaging, is that a lot of people, when they go to shoot a target, immediately it is front and center, and that's how they frame it. They put it in the center of the frame, and they get going on it. I will tell you that most of the targets in the night sky have a lot of really interesting stuff around them. So, you can think about it a couple of ways. One is maybe look at people who've taken pictures of this target, but with a wide field rig. Maybe they take it with a short refractor or a lens, and you can see what's around it. You can also go to something like the Deep Sky Survey and zoom out. If your field of view is, a degree by a degree, zoom out until you get something like a 2 degree by 2 degree field of view. And you might be shocked at what's right next door to that target. A lot of planetary nebulas, for example, have really interesting galaxies in close proximity to them. A lot of times, nebulas have other nebulas in close proximity to them. Sometimes you can get something like a galaxy cluster and a planetary nebula all in the same field of view. So when you're getting ready to take an image, take advantage of your field of view. If you have something like a wide field rig where you got a 2 degree by 2 degree field of view, don't just put it in the center. Zoom out a little bit and see what you can get, because you'd be surprised at how much you can fit into that field of view. Sometimes it's really cool if you offset two really interesting targets, from one corner to the other. And not only, main targets like globular clusters or nebula, sometimes you might get really bright and big stars that are interesting, and they just offset the field of view just right. Even rotating your camera can make a big difference. So if you look kind of at the picture down in the middle here, where Orion is rotated a little bit goofy, having that kind of vertically in your image stacked that way, you're limiting what kind of interesting surroundings you're actually going to get with this image. So, rotating that camera by 90 degrees, you're going to get a lot more interesting stuff in that field of view, especially if you go a little bit deeper. All the dust in the background gets very interesting. So when you're checking out these targets, don't just look at simple images maybe where they're a handful of minutes and barely stretched. Look at some where they're a little bit deeper, or like the Deep Sky Survey, where you can stretch them a lot and you can see what is in the background of that area. There's a lot of stuff. If you expose long enough anywhere in the night sky and go deep enough, you're going to run into IFN, or you're going to run into background faint narrowband nebulosity. So don't be afraid to explore a little bit. Maybe something that would have fit a little bit better, kind of when we were talking previously, also is talking about the winds. Both, kind of the winds are going to affect a lot of how well you can guide, especially if you're taxing your mount a little bit and have a little bit more gear maybe than you should have on your mount. If you do, then I definitely highly recommend maybe sticking away from you know, your luminance, or maybe your hydrogen alpha, if that's going to be your luminance for your target, and stick to the color. You can get away sometimes with some bad tracking if you're shooting color data. You can blur that color data a little bit. Your stars don't have to be perfectly round. So, you know, it doesn't always work out where you're going to get a steady sky and no wind. But if you can't track well and you can't get good round stars, you know, maybe you want to stick away from those really kind of high detail images. So, you know, the way I think about it is usually I have 2 or 3 images going at once. And that way I have something to fall back on if the conditions don't allow for great imaging for the night. You know, I always have something where I can go back and get some Thano 3, or I can get some RGB that I just need to add to an image. And that way, you know, you don't feel like you're just trying to force something, because you're just never going to be really thrilled with luminance or you know, hydrogen alpha's luminance if the conditions don't provide for that. So these are just some points to think about, you know, when you're trying to set up an imaging run for the night. And I think the more clear sky time you have, the more important this stuff is to think about. If you only have a handful of clear nights a year, you know, good luck, and, you know, go after what you can go after when you have time. If you have a lot of time to kind of work with, and you're willing to put in maybe 15, 20, 30 hours to an image, then it makes sense to become, you know, a little bit more strategic in how you actually acquire your targets. I've seen some interesting threads on cloudy nights as well, talking about going after more rarely imaged targets or more interesting targets. And I just put together a kind of quick list of stuff that I look for going after things, you know, once you get past those first 10 or 20 really interesting targets. So first off, you're always going to have your Messier catalog. Going beyond the Messier catalog, you might look into like the Vandenberg, and then the Bright Nebula catalog, the Dark Nebula catalog. You might look into planetary nebulas. You might look into Wolf-Rayet objects. You know, if you've got that time to put into targets, sometimes going after stuff that's a little more faint, a little more interesting, allows you to maybe not discover new things, but maybe allows you to go a little bit deeper on targets that you haven't necessarily seen a lot of interesting things on. So when I go into something like a hair-big Haro object, that VDB 152 in the top left corner of this image was one that Adam and I collaborated on last year, and we enjoyed that a lot. And as we were imaging that, you know, there weren't a ton of really good examples out there. And when we started imaging it, we were doing it in broadband only, and we were really enjoying it and saw some cool stuff. Then we went into a little bit of narrowband data, started getting hydrogen alpha. Now this image in the top left here is zoomed in pretty far, but you can see that hydrogen alpha band coming kind of across here. That goes all the way across the whole field of view of a whole 2 degree by 2 degree field of view. And that's a supernova remnant that looks really, really cool. And you can see actually even in here, there's some really tight kind of bands where there's some shock waves that happen. So we were excited about that. And there's also a planetary nebula a lot further out of this field of view that showed up. And then even further on, as we were processing it, Adam found this little tiny red splotch right here. And it was something that both of us were unaware of, and that was a hair-big Haro object. So as we got into processing that and collecting more data, we decided we really wanted to kind of highlight that little part in there. And so we were like, all right, let's collect some more hydrogen alpha on it. Let's process this up a little bit more closely and go after this and try to get this kind of cleanly. Getting a couple of steady nights made a big difference, and all of a sudden this thing just kind of magically appeared in front of us, and it's a really, really sharp hair-big Haro object. It's kind of one of the ones that are less commonly imaged, like maybe in the Pelican Nebula. Planetary nebulas are very cool too. Talking about targets that are imaged less frequently, planetary nebulas are imaged very frequently, but something that is not imaged quite as frequently are the surrounding outer halos. So on the bottom left here, we have the Cat's Eye Nebula. Now that one is reasonably bright compared to a lot of planetary nebulas, but But still, in the same regards, this one has a lot of stuff going on in the outer shells here. You can see both in oxygen and in hydrogen alpha, and even in S2. And this is kind of like most of them, where if you go deeper and expose longer and you're narrowband on these planetary nebulas, there is always something to see outside of them. The part that I was most excited about in this one isn't all of this funky stuff going on the outside, which was also very cool, but it's the stuff on the inside right around it. Most planetary nebula that I've shot, if you go deep enough on them, you get right outside of this very bright core. They have concentric oxygen shells on them. Most planetary nebulas, they follow the same kind of physical pattern where they put out periodic oxygen, or O3, burps is what they call them. And you get these shells, and you might not be able to see it quite as well on this slide, but if you open that image and look at it more closely, you can see that I think that there are 6 or 7 concentric shells here, and that's something that's very cool, both to capture and just kind of see emerge. And then also, like a lot of them, not only once you get past these concentric shells, you get this kind of faint outer larger halo, and that appears in a lot of them, sort of, I'd say the Eskimo Nebula, the Saturn Nebula, the Blue Snowball, a lot of them that I've shot, they have kind of this really bright central area, concentric shells, and then this outer bright halo, and then a lot of them even have a lot of this kind of structure that happened, right when the star exploded, that's expanding a lot faster than everything else. Going beyond that, integrated flux nebula is always cool. It's maybe imaged a little more frequently now that people have faster, shorter setups. So, when you see people post M81 and M82 in the same field of view, you're going to get a lot of IFN in the background if they have a fast, wide setup. There's also a lot of stuff, maybe around M106 where there's IFN, and a lot of stuff kind of up around Polaris. So that stuff is always really cool to go after. If you have reasonably dark skies, if you have the time to put into it, they're kind of just, they're targets that aren't shared quite as often, quite as exciting, presentation until recently, but there's still a lot of new stuff to really share with that. Another thing that I would talk about is explore different filters. Recently I've gotten into shooting with near infrared. Now, near infrared doesn't necessarily give you a lot of really differentiating features across the night sky, but there are particular targets, particular kind of targets where you can get something that's very interesting. Down here in the bottom right, I have what are protostars, and these protostars, this one is GLMT 1000. They are newborn stars with little puffs of hydrogen alpha kind of coming off the tail from solar wind. But if you use that near infrared filter, you can get little bits of hot spots right around where the star is being born or was born recently. Now, you're not seeing through physical dust like you would in actual infrared, but you can see through narrowband data such as hydrogen alpha. And so a target like this, where most of the image is dominated by narrowband hydrogen alpha, you can see through that somewhat with a near infrared filter. And that near infrared filter in this little area made all the difference in the world, because you actually get that little hot spot right here, right around this, what is called a propyloid or protostar, which is a newborn star with this kind of hydrogen alpha being blown off by a solar wind. And then as we're looking at this image, another thing that I just kind of like bringing up again is the framing of this image in this field of view, is getting something that kind of balances it out by having a really bright star over here in the bottom corner of it, and then having these floating off on the side. If you were just to zoom in on that, you'd have to zoom in a lot more, and then the image might start breaking down some. So zooming out just a tiny bit, finding something else interesting to put in this field of view just gives the image a little bit more intrigue. And then going on again, think about where you are. A lot of times, a lot of us travel to actually image. We might go to star parties, or we might just drive down to a dark site for the weekend or something like that. So I always like bringing up this SH2308. When I lived in Pittsburgh, that was a target that was completely out of my range up in the north. But it gets reasonably high when you come down to Florida. And so with a handful of hours, I didn't know at the time I was going to be moving to Florida. I was able to grab something I never would have grabbed before. So, think about some of the southern targets if you live up north. Maybe think about the Rofechius region. Think about Eta Carina. There's a bunch of stuff down there that that you could shoot that you wouldn't normally get to shoot if you live up in the north, even thinking about like the Centaurus galaxy, or even Centauri, the globular cluster. There's just a lot of stuff that you can shoot just by coming a few degrees south. This stuff might all be down really low on the southern horizon, depending on where you are, but a lot of it's bright and a lot of it's big, and there's an opportunity, even if it's really low on the horizon, to go after it and get something that you wouldn't normally get. Finally, think about animations. And so animations will usually include dynamic objects, whether it's the sun and getting solar flares from the sun. You can get any of the planets or the moon. Especially the planets are cool because you can see them actually rotating in an animation. Some of the deep sky objects that are really cool are comets and asteroids, variable nebula, variable stars. Comets are really cool because you can take a comet, take a wide field with a comet and censor deep sky objects. I think my favorite, maybe one of my very favorite images I've seen in recent years was a comet right between the Heart and Soul Nebula. I can't remember at this point which comet that was, but it was really cool seeing an animation of that actually kind of floating through the field of view of the Heart and Soul Nebula. And then even asteroids, a lot of people are doing more stuff with asteroids recently, whether they're ones that are kind of faint and far away, or ones that are coming by the Earth, and ones that are kind of passing us, and they're actually tracking on those asteroids that are passing Earth very closely. So the near Earth objects, those ones are very cool. And then ones that are overlooked a good bit are variable nebula or variable stars, where you can actually see stuff that is very far away moving over time, which is very rare. Outside of our solar system, there's not a lot of objects where you can see a lot of dynamic events outside of our solar system, but these two, to me, they are very, very cool. Those and or maybe supernova that are emerging in galaxies. So we were lucky enough to have one in the Fireworks galaxy emerge recently, and obviously, that's kind of a well-known galaxy and one that a lot of people image anyway. So whenever supernova came in there, there's a lot of cool animations out there kind of showing the difference between the galaxy with and without that very recently. So I think that pretty much covers, all of the target selection stuff. I'm going to pause for a minute, David or Alex. Any questions before we move on?
We've got a couple of things that came in. One of them is, how do you decide whether to go RGB, RRR, GGG, BBB, etc. in your acquisition?
So in my case, I always rotate through at this point. For a while, when I was imaging, I would go red when it was lowest, nearest the horizon, then I would go green, and then I would go blue. And the reason for that is that your dispersion is going to be a lot less in the red channel than it is going to be in the blue channel. So when you are shooting low in the sky, you're not going to have as much effect from the atmosphere on the red filter as you would on the blue. So that, the kind of end result of that is shoot blue all time in the sky and the red lowest. It doesn't take too many images of not completing your color channels and not being able to complete the image to decide that, in reality, it makes more sense to rotate through the filters. Now, if you don't have your sequence automated, it's going to be a lot more work to rotate through them. So at that point, that's what I would recommend. If you don't have automation set up, shoot red lower in the sky, green as it's approaching the meridian, and then blue as it crosses the meridian.
Okay. So Greg mentioned that he'd been using the DSO browser app. I wasn't aware there was actually an app for it, but he said while the website is working okay, the app seems to be having issues at the moment that they're working on, just for information.
And I experienced the same thing. Honestly, I tried the app not too long ago, and I decided to veer away from it for a while. The website is amazing. It's a great resource and great source of information, but I did not have a great experience with the app at this point. But I do think it is fairly new, so hopefully they'll get that sorted out before too long.
Yeah. All right. So Andrew is asking, if you're blending HA with RGB, what is the ratio of RGB versus HA? Seems some examples I've seen on Bill Snyder's site are about 3 hours of HA for each hour of RGB. Is that about right?
That is a little bit of a personal preference and a target preference. So there are some targets that you will shoot where the RGB is barely going to show up at all. And there's some where you're going to have a mix of narrowband and reflection nebula where your RGB might show up heavily. Typically, I lean very heavily in favor of the narrowband to the broadband or the luminance to your RGB, because the data is so much more valuable that you use as your luminance or your synthetic luminance compared to your color channels, that it just makes sense to do that. So I might lean even more heavily where I will do something like a 6 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. If I'm doing HARGB, I might do a 6 to 1 to 1 or even longer than that. A lot of targets are almost invisible to the broadband unless you go very deep on them, but are very bright in the narrowband. You know, and it also depends on where you shoot from as well. So, you know, somebody like me who lives in a red-white zone, there's just not a lot of point in collecting a ton of RGB data other than collecting it for the stars and maybe the super bright reflection nebula. So when I'm shooting from a red-white zone, I will pick probably the best night of the month for a target to get my RGB data, and the rest of the time will be on narrowband. So, you know, 6-1-1-1 ratio might even be conservative. I might go longer. Sometimes I might go 10 or 15-1-1-1 ratio from a red-white zone. Now, if I lived somewhere where the skies were a lot darker, that would change a little bit. I like broadband. I like the look of broadband. I think it has a little more of a natural feel. It's easier to blend the narrowband into broadband when you have better broadband data, but you're just not going to get, you know, you might get a good synthetic luminance or something from a red-white zone if you get really deep on it. But if you live in a red-white zone, you're not going to get great broadband data. So, you know, if that's your case, then I would suggest, you know, spending as much time as possible in the narrowband and get enough broadband to get some good stars. You know, my recommendation is usually maybe somewhere between 3 and 6 hours in the broadband to get good-looking stars.
Okay, so related to that, Mars is asking, does the type of equipment you have affect those choices?
Yes. Yes, it does. And so we can look at that in a handful of different ways, but right off the bat, the width of your filters affects those choices. If you have very narrowband filters, you're going to get a lot more kind of quality data, I would say. So if you are shooting, you know, these are the extreme examples, but if you're shooting with a 3 nanometer hydrogen alpha filter with a Sony sensor that has super low read noise, your narrowband data is going to look fantastic. However, if you're shooting with a 12 nanometer astronomic filter in hydrogen alpha with a non-modified DSLR, then you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. So excuse me, there's a middle ground too there, obviously. You know, probably the middle ground a lot of the times is people are shooting with a mono DSLR maybe that isn't quite as low read noise, and maybe they have a narrowband filter that's 5 or 7 nanometers in width. And at that point, you know, maybe I would kind of find a middle ground there. The more narrow your narrowband filter is, the more contrast you're going to get between the background sky and the target you are shooting. Now, obviously, if your narrowband filter is wider, you're going to have to go deeper and longer to get good contrast. And at that point, you know, the reason I say it makes a difference is that the difference between your narrowband data and your broadband data is not going to be quite as great. So at that point, I don't think it's the end of the world. You kind of find a little better middle ground. Now, if your narrowband filter is really narrow, broadband data, your narrowband filter is really narrow and your sensor is really clean, then you're going to get some pretty amazing, you know, narrowband data. So you can either spend forever on it and get a perfectly clean luminance or synthetic luminance in your narrowband, or you can decide, well, this is a pretty bright target and I want to get some more broadband and then go after it. So yeah, it definitely makes a difference. Speed makes a little bit of difference too. Whether or not your instrument is f2 or f7 can make a big difference. And a lot of it becomes a feel thing as you're shooting it. You know, you can see usually in 1 or 2 sub exposures how bright your target is. in like the North American or the Pelican Nebula, the Veils, you know, all those, one exposure, it's going to show up and man, it's going to smack you and be very cool and very bright right away. There's going to be some though, like where you're trying to shoot the outer halo of the cat's eye here, and man, you can barely see anything at all in that, and you know you need to go deep in the narrowband to get something come out well. So yeah, you know, with the cat's eye, I would say 80% of my data was in narrowband and 20% was in broadband and luminance. With the Veil, I would say it was closer maybe to a 60-40 mix because the narrowband is so bright on the Veil Nebula.
Okay, related to the narrowband question, Andrew was asking, do you recommend narrowband for galaxies?
I recommend hydrogen alpha on a handful of galaxies. One thing you have to know about galaxies is that the majority of the galaxies in the night sky are far enough away that there is probably enough redshift that you are not going to get a lot of, you know, star forming regions with your narrowband filter. That doesn't mean that I would skip it altogether, but if you're going for stuff that is far away and really small, I don't think there's much advantage to shooting narrowband. As far as oxygen, S2, you know, there's maybe not a lot of advantage to shooting oxygen or S2 on the galaxies unless you're really trying to present something unique. And I always encourage that, but you know, typically you're not going to get a ton in those. Hydrogen alpha, I think, makes a big difference in galaxies, and I try to shoot it on anything that is remotely bright and big. M51, M81, M82, M31, M101, M106. You know, a lot of those have a lot of really cool HA regions in them, and a lot of times if you get a little bit of HA in them, it doesn't take a ton. Those star forming regions often are pretty bright and pretty compact. You might get like, you know, just a handful of hours and get those really to come out well. If you blend them into your red channel, you can get, you know, those real nice kind of pink knots that you see in really good galaxy images where the star forming regions are. So, you know, I definitely recommend that on most galaxies that are bright and big. Far distant galaxies, you're not going to usually get a ton. I will mention one other thing on that too, just because I like pushing the near infrared filter. If you use near infrared, you will see countless background galaxies, and it is something that is really fun to do, no matter where you're pointed in the sky. Whether or not you're going to make an image of the data you get, just go deep with near infrared once in a while, and just look around the night sky wherever you're shooting, because there are more galaxies and stars than you could ever possibly imagine in that filter.
All right, so Thomas is mentioning a tool called CalSky. It's not one I've heard of before, but sounds like it's looking, you know, a tool for doing target availability for a certain day and time.
I'm pretty familiar with that. CalSky is a program for calculating where satellites are going to be, and I use it. I don't know if you guys have ever seen my picture of the International Space Station crossing in front of the sun or at the moon, and that's what it's good for. And you can put in your location and you can tell it to notify you, and it'll tell you if the International Space Station or any other satellite is going to have some kind of syzygy with the moon or the sun or something like that. So it's kind of fun to chase those kind of syzygies.
All right, so another question. You talk about shooting different color channels and luminosity. Do you use specialized cameras for that, or is it possible with common DSLRs?
Common DSLRs, typically you're going to shoot wide open. You're not going to use special filters. But there are caveats like everything else. Depending on where you live, you know, we talked about already, you can use a narrowband filter with the DSLR. You're going to be fighting an uphill battle if your DSLR is not Astor modified, and just kind of quickly going over that, that is removing your infrared filter, or I'm sorry, the infrared filter, and removing that allows you to see kind of into the hydrogen alpha. If you don't remove that, you're going to have a hard time seeing hydrogen alpha, and you're already only getting 1 in 4 pixels with that red channel. So if you have a Astor modified DSLR and you want to shoot hydrogen alpha, a lot of times you can get some pretty good data with that. Now, moving beyond that, I definitely recommend to try it. Those filters usually hold their value pretty well. So if you want to get a used clip-in DSLR narrowband filter, you can usually get that and then probably sell it for about what you bought it for not too long afterwards, if you don't want to keep going that route. But if you don't have a modified DSLR for astronomy, it's going to be a tough battle, and I probably wouldn't recommend it. I always like seeing people try stuff, but it's a tough sell. If you do have one, I definitely recommend trying it. Beyond that, there are specialty filters that you can also get for DSLR. Now, you can get ones where you can get an original white balance filter. So if you're shooting a Galaxy, but you have a Astor modified DSLR, you might want to put that OWB filter in there so that your Galaxy has more natural colors. If you're shooting in light pollution, there are all kinds of light pollution filters that you can choose from that can help you maybe get a little more contrast. Much like a narrowband filter allows you to get a lot more contrast in your target and the background sky, there are light pollution filters that try to accomplish the same thing. I can talk briefly about a handful of them. There's an Astronomic CLS filter, and that one I think comes in the CCD or the DSLR form. That one is a very aggressive light pollution filter. I think it gives good results as far as improving the contrast. I would not recommend that for a DSLR typically, because the color balance is very difficult with that filter. Now, you might want to consider shooting with that filter in to get a synthetic luminance, and with it out to get your actual color data. I've done that before with my CCD, where I've replaced the luminance filter with a CLS CCD filter and gotten some good luminance with it, and then shot RGB to get my color. Now, Hoytech makes a great DSLR filter, and I believe, I can never remember the version number. I want to say it's their V4 filter is a good mix for a DSLR. Now, somebody can definitely hop in and correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a long time since I've used that, but they have a number of different filters that are made for different specific cameras, whether it's a DSLR or a CCD, and whether or not you want it notched more for narrowband data or notched more for broadband data. I want to say maybe it's their LTS V4 filter, but certainly someone chime in if they've had better experience with a different one than that. And that's what I have for that, Adam. David.
Yeah.
Hey, Josh, hang on for a second there, David, whoever's taking over here. I've been corrected, and appropriately so. I used CalSky. This is Alex. I use CalSky for calculating when my transits are going to be. But as Thomas or somebody pointed out to me, hey, you can use it for a lot of other stuff. So I checked it out, and Thomas has put in a link to it there. And yeah, there's a place in CalSky you can go for deep space stuff. So thank you for pointing that out to us all. And I wanted to make sure that everybody listening 6 years from now on YouTube in an old archive of this, that I stand corrected on that one. And their CalSky does have other uses.
I'm not sure where you're at in your presentation here, Josh. We do have a few other questions coming in. They may be slightly off topic, so we might finish your stuff and then go back into them.
Yeah, there's kind of a bit to go through. I think what we're going to do is skip the equipment selection for tonight, because I think that one is worth a whole episode on its own. What I want to do is touch just briefly on data organization, and then we can come back and do any more questions, because I see that we are actually running low on time, which is great, because I love when we get a lot of questions. But I do want to touch on this data acquisition, data organization section briefly, and then we'll come back and take some more questions, if that works. David, were there any other ones that were directly relevant right now, or can we come back in just a few minutes?
Yeah, I think we should come back to them.
Okay. All right, so this section will be pretty brief, but it's definitely one I want to touch on tonight. And the main reason I want to touch on it tonight is because it's something that was not hammered home to me when I got started, and I regret it a lot. What you get so excited when you're imaging, especially when you're just getting going on imaging, when you see something come in and you recognize it. Your first time that you get, you know, M51 come in, or M31 or M42, and you see it and it's big and bright on your screen, you are very excited. And I still get that excited about any target I take. A lot of times I take fainter images now where you don't necessarily see anything on the screen at all for a night. And maybe after a whole night of stacking it, you don't see anything, and it might take me like a week to get there. But I'm even excited once that happens still. But the one thing that I didn't think a lot about at the time is, hey, I might be doing this for a while. I might be imaging for a while. I might want to come back and look at the data I've collected later on. And certainly at the beginning, I never thought, hey, I could use this data some other time in my Astor imaging career. I certainly didn't know the value of integrating and going deeper and deeper on targets when I first started. So I definitely want to drive home the point, when you collect data, if you at all think that you might be doing this for a while, get it organized, stay organized, and keep consistent with how you actually keep your data. Don't just do some hodgepodge of throwing them all into random filters and or random folders and on all over your desktop and with random labels and stuff like that. Because as soon as you start collecting even mediocre data, you can use that later on. To this point in my career, I could use pretty much any color data I've ever collected and combine it with luminance data I get from a deep sky image from a dark site and really make something great. Your color data is almost always going to be useful. Your narrowband data is almost always going to be useful. And I wish that I knew that. I had a couple of years go by in the beginning where I just did not do well at organizing or retaining my data. So what I mean by that is, first of all, calibrate everything that you take right away. And if you don't know about that, learn more about it. But what I mean by that, take your flats, take your darks, take your bias data, and calibrate it all right away. You may want to keep all of those. You may want to keep all of your darks. You may want to keep all of your biases. You don't necessarily need to, because if you're calibrating your data right away, then all you need is basically raw data and your calibrated data. You may learn as time goes on, or you may change programs that you use for calibrating your data. And if you do that, you might be able to get a little bit more out of it. You might change from nebulosity to pixel sight, or from deep sky stacker to nebulosity over to CCD stack or something like that. So you might be able to get another 5 or 10% out of your data by changing the program you use. But one thing that you do not want to have happen is a big stack of raw data and not have your calibration frames for it. I certainly have a lot from when I first started where I have, maybe 5 or 10 or 20 hours worth of raw data and no calibration frames to go with. I mean, it's almost impossible to really process that data well if you don't have the proper calibration frames or the calibrated frames for it. So, definitely always keep your raw data. Date your data as well, and keep notes on them. Save your processing runs. So, when I say keep your raw data, the reason I say that is you never know what you might actually collect in your raw data. You might have got a supernova. You might have been the first person in the whole world to collect supernova, or you might have been somebody who was like 5th or 10th, but it might be still really useful information in your data. You might have an asteroid going across your field of view that is interesting. And again, you might just want to learn how to stack better. You might try a new program and want to try to stack your data differently or calibrate it differently. So, that's all stuff that when you're first getting going, and it may take you a while to think, this stuff's just not that important. I will, just collect it all, throw it all together, and as soon as I get a great image, that's all garbage. I don't need it anymore. It's worth holding on to. You're going to get, long spells of bad skies. You're going to learn something new during those bad skies, and you're going to really wish you had this data to mess with. You can always usually borrow some from somebody else on the internet, but there's nothing quite like doing it with your own. So I highly recommend keeping your own. Like I said, with the dates, if you have a good naming system, a lot of these newer programs like Sequence Generator Pro, or maybe even Nebulosity and Deep Sky Stacker and Backyard EOS, they all, I think, give you options on how to name your files. Put that date in your file. Put the filter type in your file. Put the sub-exposure length in there. You want to know, kind of what you're actually collecting, because it can become important. If it's for scientific data, it can be important. if you're comparing the different stuff you've done, you know, before and trying to improve on it, that stuff can be important as well. So find a way to get that information. If it's not in your file name, keep notes on it. Just put, you know, maybe put a little spreadsheet in your folder where you're putting that information in. The last thing is saving your processing runs. You know, that part is kind of, it's not vital, but it is cool, and it's something that a lot of those automated sequencers do a really good job of, is I can start a target this year, and if I get, you know, part way to where I want to be, I can just pick that right up again next year and resume and finish that target. So, you know, if you don't have something where you can save a sequence like Sequence Generator Pro, then at least save your progress somehow in a spreadsheet, or even just write a couple notes down and save it somewhere so that you know where you want to pick up next year. Maybe you collected your RGB frames and you wanted to get some hydrogen alpha to throw into a galaxy. You know, make sure that you know what you need to get next year so you can hop on it. Sometimes all it takes is a night to finish a target. Maybe you shot M106 and you're really excited about getting the hydrogen alpha jet in there. So all you need to do is shoot, you know, 7 or 8 hours of hydrogen alpha to really complete that image. Go ahead and write that down and say, next year I want to grab this. I'm not ready to publish until I get that next year. So make sure you write that down. Getting in, you know, I'm going to share with you my folder trees and how I organize. It doesn't matter necessarily how you do it. You definitely don't have to do it like I do. But if you do, if you do think that this is important, like I'm trying to convince you, then come up with your own system, or you can copy mine. I'm happy to share my folder trees with you. I can even send a folder to you. But this is the way I do it, and it's the way that I've found over the last couple of years that has been 100% repeatable. Every target I've taken for the last couple of years is organized this way, and it just makes it easier. Anytime I want to go back and reprocess, anytime I want to go back and finish a target or access old data, I can go right back into my library, and I know exactly how everything is organized. I know where it is. I know when it was taken, all of that stuff, and so it's easy to hop right in. So my folder trees, you know, on my desktop, you might want to do this in your documents folder or in your wherever you want to do it. I keep it on my desktop because that computer is used mainly for Astor imaging. But I have my final images. You know, when I'm processing my images, I never know when I'm going to quite be done on it. So when I'm finally done and I produce my 7th version on Astor Bin, or my final version in Photoshop or whatever it is, once I haven't touched it for a while and I know it's final, I save it and I move it over into that folder. Or oftentimes I'll save it as soon as I publish it, and then I'll just overwrite the final one of that target and put it in that folder. Because when I'm processing, you know, usually I'll have tons of different versions in that targets folder, and I never know, you know, going back necessarily which one is the final one, because I always think they're final and I go back and do a lot with them. So I might overwrite them in that folder, and that's a good way, you know, kind of to keep your whatever you want to call it, your portfolio finalized, so you don't have to go back to an Astor Bin or Flickr or your website and download them all again to find them. So, you know, save them in there. I also have on the right side my non-images Astor stuff. You have a lot of different programs that you're probably using for processing, and maybe if you have the same computer for processing and acquiring data, you have a lot of stuff in there too. So, you know, keep all your tools, all of your Photoshop actions, PixInsight, Scalabrator, whatever you've got, keep it all in another folder so you can always go back and access it. You might have to, you know, you might get a new computer and just want to move all that stuff over quickly. If you got it sporadically all over your documents or something folder, or whatever folder you have them in, if they're not all in the same place, it might be hard to access them. It's nice whenever you go to a new computer, or you need to get an update on something, just to grab them from one place. So I'll save them all in one place. And then finally I have my Astor Imaging Library, which is my active and archived images library. And that's the one that I'm going to touch on mostly here now. So going into this, you know, once I open that, my Astor Imaging Library folder, this is sort of what it looked like at one point in time. It looks maybe a little bit messy, but as I walk through these, you'll see why. So I have my archived, which is everything I'm done with. That's every picture that I've finished, I'm done processing, I put it in there. There's quite a few in there, and it goes back now since I've been using this organizational method. My flats, I always keep a flats folder in there, and that is the last set of flats I took. So that way, if for some reason I need to go back and recalibrate something, you know, I will copy that into each target usually, but that is there. With my setup, I don't have to take them. I didn't have to take them very often because my setup was very stable, and I didn't rotate the camera a lot. So, you know, a couple months ago, that was the last time I took flats. I always keep that in there in case I want to go back. Then you'll see the names of each of the targets I'm working on. I also keep a master bias. I don't use darks with my camera. If I did, I would keep a master dark in there as well. I have a registration frame for a larger project that we were working on that was not necessarily only a personal one. And then I have a couple of different files, and here you can see this PM list was a target list, things that I wanted to go after. So as I was creating new targets, I would kind of reference that. For people who process and PixInsight, I have my subframe selector weighting expression. That's something so that every time that I want to create a new version of my weighting expressions, I can just click on that and I can actually optimize it for the particular image that I'm working on. And then finally, I have my target template folder, and that one is the key folder. The target template folder is what I use every time that I start a new image. And this is how it is organized. I have my flats, like I said, my master bias. If I have a master dark, I have the master dark in there. Then I have it organized into my raw data, my calibrated data, which in this case is called pre-processed because the program that I use labels it pre-processed and nebulosity. I have my align data, and then I have my stack data, and then I have my processing. And this way, anytime I want to go back and pick up from any point in my processing run, I can pick it up, whether it's once it's all stacked and I'm working on processing it, whether it's I'm trying a new method for actually stacking it. I can pull the stuff out of the star align data and restack it. If I want to try a new way to star align it, because I heard of some great new method that David came up with in PixInsight, I can go back into my pre-process folder and then realign it and get to this point. It's a good thing, you know, if you're doing this long enough, you're going to run into wants and needs for each one of these sets of data. It's a good way to organize it. It's a good way to have all of it. Data storage is pretty cheap now. You know, you might not be super cheap to do, you know, all solid state data storage so that you're processing all of it on the run. But if you want to back this all up and then you want to come back and grab this data at some other point, you know, putting stuff on a hard disk drive or in the cloud has become very cheap. I recommend at least keeping this much stuff, if not more stuff, whenever you're organizing when you're done. Going into each folder, you know, this is all pretty simple and straightforward stuff, but no matter what target you're shooting, make sure you have enough folders for all the data you might possibly take. You know, most targets I shoot are not going to necessarily have data in each one of these folders, but you never know. You might be shooting something and run into somebody who said, oh, there's just this tiny little oxygen bubble right outside the galaxy that you want to shoot. And so all of a sudden at the last minute you add, you know, half a night of data in there. Just put this into your template folder, and it's not a big deal if you don't fill up every one of these folders, but at least you have them all there. And when you're going back later, you can check them out and see if that data is in there. And finally, going into kind of the processing folder, this is how I have mine set up. You know, have your setup however you want, but make sure it's consistent so you can go back in. When I process each of these independently. I process my color data independently from my narrowband data, which I process independently from my luminance or my synthetic luminance. And then typically near the end of my processing run, I combine them all into one space up here. There's going to be a lot of files. You know, if you work in PixInsight, you might only have one or two files because you save it all as one file where it shows all the processes. Somebody like me who hops back and forth between PixInsight and Photoshop, I try to label them very specifically and, you know, kind of get a progression of how I did my RGB, a progression of how I did my narrowband and my luminance. And then as I move into combining them, I get a progression up here. And then finally, every published image goes into this folder, and then the final published image goes into that final images folder that I showed you before. Again, you don't have to do it like I did it, but having something that is consistent, having it be reliable, and doing it the same way every time, at least you know where stuff is, why it's there, and where to find it later. So, you know, again, this isn't groundbreaking stuff, but it is also stuff that, you know, once you're in it for a little while, seems fairly obvious, but when you first start, and maybe even a couple of years in, you don't really think about that much. It's something that I always wish somebody told me earlier on. I have a lot of data that I really wish I could get my hands on now that I can't, or I can't get on it, you know, in a usable way. And so it's something, you know, I just try to pass on and share with other people because it's something that I definitely wish was shared with me when I first got going. I think, yeah, that pretty much covers everything. You know, this last slide is more kind of about geeking out a little bit more, and getting more intense in your data organization, maybe doing collaborations and stuff. But it never hurts to go more and more in depth on how you organize your data. We've done quite a few collaborations here as a team on the Astor Imaging channel between guys, and at some point in time, knowing a lot more specific information, not just about the data you collected, but the characteristics of the data you collected, and how the noise compares, can be useful later on. I'm not going to go too deep into that now. We'll go back to questions, but I just will say that it doesn't necessarily take a huge amount of time to put more information about the data you collected into a spreadsheet, and you probably won't be sorry you did it. Just, you know, if you're spending 10 hours of collecting data and another 10 hours of processing, spending half an hour on really getting organized and specific about the quality of your data and the type of data and when you took it and with what gear, at some point in time, it's probably going to be valuable to you. I think that it's worth, you know, going a little bit deeper. It's not a necessity, but it's something that's worth considering. David, I think that, yep, that is everything I have. So
all right,
I can pause here.
Yeah, let's see if we can hit some of these questions. I don't know if we'll have time to get to all of them or not, but we'll try to get to what we can. So there's a big thread going on in the chat about minimum exposure time and that sort of stuff, right? So you might be able to add your thoughts there. Specifically, Basil was asking, are there best practices for calculating minimum exposure time per filter based on image data from others, or can I use someone's Astrobin image data to give me an idea of what I need to do at a minimum?
Well, so David, I'll let you give your 2 cents, but I'll give mine too real quick. You know, you can look at this a couple different ways. You can look at it from a very technical perspective and know that, you know, you want to clear your read noise by a certain very specific amount. And that is the minimum required amount, and anything beyond that will reduce the dynamic range of your image. From a practical standpoint, as far as collecting calibration frames and stuff like that, you know, I think that you'll usually be able to tell pretty quickly. You want a little bit, if you're using a DSLR, you want a little bit of separation from the left side of, you know, your histogram, where you're getting it maybe almost a third of the way across. With a CCD, you know, you want to get sort of a similar separation, and you want to clear your read noise by a good bit. You know, specifically, I've used, you know, Sony sensors and 8300s and 16200, and I run into the values that make the most sense. With my Sony sensor, I know I want my ADU value to be about 12 to 1300 ADU, and that's where I know I'm clearing the read noise enough that I'm looking kind of more at the noise in the sky and less in my sensor. You know, and it is definitely very sensor specific. There are lots of websites and programs out there where you can put in your specific equipment, you know, technical details, and if you do that, it'll give you a recommended exposure time. I have not found any of them to be, you know, really super reliable. And typically, I think the best way to do it is kind of come up with a standard sublength that you use for a certain kind of skies, and use that consistently. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, if you're collecting a handful of hours of data, just having a consistent sublength is really going to be, you know, the ideal way to do it. And, you know, talk to people who have put out successful images, you know, from similar conditions to you, and find out what they're using.
Yeah, that's right along with I think what both Alex and I said in the chat as well. You know, we tend to, you know, maybe you start with an exposure calculator, right? But really, you know, you take a stab at it, and then you kind of adjust it for what actually works, right? So you kind of build up an idea, a history, based on acquiring some data, and you just kind of stick with those numbers after that point for your specific site. And you do that for all the different sites you tend to visit, and build up an idea of what works for different conditions for your equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll follow up on that too, is that I know at dark sites, the things I kind of pay attention to is I go as long as I can without blowing out my stars and my broadband data. You can find that out pretty quickly. If 1 or 2 subs in, look at some of your brightest stars and find out whether those stars are blown out. And if only a couple are blown out and you're okay with that, then that's probably a good number. If the majority of your stars are blown out, then you might want to back off that a little bit, or think about taking 2 sets of exposures, one for your stars and one for your background. I will say at home, most people shoot from bad light pollution, and most people probably expose for too long. If I was exposing properly at home, I would be shooting for 30 to 90 seconds at most. I don't want thousands and thousands of frames to stack. So, I know even with my usually 50 to 100 to 200 or 300 frames that I'm gonna kind of bring back my dynamic range by stacking that many. So I expose longer, up to 2 or 3 or 5 minutes at home, even though it's a little bit blown out on those, because I know I'm going to have 50 to 100 subs at least. And I don't want to be stacking 10 times that amount. So, my guess is most people probably overexpose at home, which is fine as long as you're stacking enough frames kind of to bring back that dynamic range and you're not blowing out all of your stars.
Yeah, it's a good point. So let's see. Next question. Jeremy's is a little specific here. Let's see if we can come back to that one. Sean actually asked, how long do you keep your dark library?
Again, depending on your camera, depending on how accurate it is. If it's a DSLR, I went away from using darks because I thought they added noise. If it's an 8300 or a 16200 like a KAF type sensor, then I will keep them, I would keep them usually probably for 3 to 6 months. For the Sony sensors, I only use them on long exposures for narrowband data, and at that point I might keep them for a little bit longer, like 6 to 12 months.
All right, next question.
Sean said 460, which is I believe that's a Sony sensor. I think unless you see a big difference in the response in your sensor, I would think that every 6 to 12 months I think is fine for a dark library for that Sony sensor.
Yeah, in general, I'm changing my temperatures, between summer and winter, right? My set point. So yeah. I tend to retake every 6 months or so anyway, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. You might go from -10 to -20, and so whenever you change your set point, maybe take a new set of darks.
Yeah. So what IR filter are you using?
I use the Astor NIR-I filter, and I believe it was I always forget if it was a Sloan or their Johnson. I think it was a Sloan I filter. It was their Gen 1 because it was on clearance. I think it went from 700 nanometers up to like 890 or something like that. But that's the one I use. I think they have a new version out. And I think with a lot of those, they are pretty much the same. They cover the same part of the spectrum, regardless of which company you get. Astrodons were supposedly parafocal with mine, which they weren't because my refractor doesn't correct as well out there, so I have to refocus anyways. But it does not have bad reflections, which made a huge difference because I've read a lot about having bad reflections in the NIR, and that Astrodon did not have those.
Okay, next question is from Frederick. He's asking about the recommendations for a mount in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. I think we should probably skip that one for night. I think we have some other videos that kind of cover that one. That one's a little bit loaded for adding in tonight. In astrophotography, do you go for the most objective view of the object you're imaging, or do you go for the most beautiful finish?
Well, that's even more loaded.
Yeah.
Personal preference, I go for both at the same time.
Yeah, I certainly try to exhibit what is there. I don't try to distort what is there, per se.
It depends if you're shooting broadband and narrowband too. I mean, if you're shooting narrowband, you don't have much option. I will say that in my presentation, I did go into a part where I said that with broadband data and specifically galaxies and globular clusters, I am much more conservative with my processing. With narrowband data or near-infrared data, I'm willing to take a lot more liberties because mostly it's outside of the visible spectrum anyways, and the way you mix it is not going to be natural. Although I always tend towards a natural palette, which looks more like a red, green, blue palette than a Hubble palette, for example, because I prefer a natural palette look. But that's the direction I usually go.
But the thing you've got to remember in this is that it is your choice.
Absolutely.
Is it art? Is it science? Well, it's actually neither. For those of us who hang around on cloudy nights, how many responses have they had on that one thread is it up in general?
Or both.
If I were in a nebula, would I be able to see it? Nobody knows. I mean, it's gone on for 495 or something like that responses so far, and there is no one answer to exactly what does this look like. Okay, so make it look like you want it to look like. Just don't make stuff up. Or
if you do, say you do.
Yeah, or declare that you've made it up. I mean, my pictures of the volcanoes exploding around or erupting around Mauna Kea and the observatories. I mean, I tell people it's a collage, so then it's okay. But no, yeah, it's up to you. And like Josh says, that's a really loaded question. There is no answer to that question.
Yeah. All right. So, Basil, I'm not sure if this is you in the room that asked this or not, but he's asking how much data on how you process an image do you save?
Oh, a lot. Personally, I do a lot, and I think it's because I take way too many small steps in between, and I use Photoshop and PixInsight, and I go back and forth. So a typical image for me may end up having a folder that has 10 gigabytes worth of saved data in it. If it's a single frame, if it's a mosaic, it might have even more. And that's really, I think probably a personal thing. I think the way that Haitham usually processes his, he probably only has maybe a few hundred megabytes in a folder processing because he goes through it pretty quickly and does everything with adjustment layers where he kind of does it all together. So again, sort of a specific thing, but my steps are very incremental, and I like to go back and visit them, and I save starless versions of every channel and starry versions of every channel, and lightly stretched and largely stretched ones. And maybe it's more because at least at one point I just was more bored and like to see what all of it looked like and explore it later.
Basil, you're in the room, right? We'll unmute you here. How do we unmute Basil?
Yeah, let me see. Let's see. I think he has to unmute himself.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Ask your question.
Well, I was thinking, as you go through the various steps in Photoshop or PixInsight, and you try adjusting this gamma, or you try doing a stretch here or there. I mean, all the little steps that go into producing an image. If you happen to find something that really works well, do you keep track of that, or you just try and remember, oh, this worked great once before, and I'll try it again?
I will say that I use layers and folders extensively. And so I try to at least break it up into chunks and label them for the progress I've made. So, if I usually save them as soon as I kind of do a little stretch on them, and I save them, once I make some progress and label it as the progress I made. So I might say, stretched and color calibrated and background neutralized. And then I might say stars removed and ready to combine with luminance. And then within each of those, I kind of typically usually label each folder with the step I was taking on that point. And then I can see that if you are even more advanced and use adjustment layers, you can actually save it as a Photoshop document and see what adjustments you've made and actually tweak them. And that'll help. Now, PixInsight is a whole other ballgame too, where you can kind of go back and see the steps that you've done as well. I think for those of us that hop back and forth, maybe it's a little bit of a struggle to see specifically, what you've done across the programs, but there are definitely options within each of those programs to see the progress you've made.
Chuck, are you referring to just saving the files, or are you also saying that you keep notes someplace on every steps the steps you took, the parameters you set, and all those things?
The notes that I take are just inherent in the folder and file name, the folder and layer names in Photoshop, or you might call them in groups instead of folders. But there might be a group that's called high pass filtering. There might be a group that's called color calibration or color tweaking. There might be a group that is, fixing stars. So I might take a couple steps in there, and then you can usually go back and see based on what kind of layer it is, what action I've actually taken on that layer.
I do something similar in PixInsight where I tend to save things off as desktop icons, and the PixInsight allows you to add notes to the desktop icons, right? So you can add comments and stuff in there. So I essentially have that stuff encoded in the project file when I save it, right? So it keeps it all in there along with the history, right? So you can see how things progressed and everything, right? So
right. Yep.
Both
very similar idea.
I think the last few questions, I think we're running out of time here, and these are getting pretty far off topic, so we should probably skip those for tonight. If you have any other questions a little more closely related to Josh's topic, definitely ask him now. Anything else in the room? No, sounds like that's it. All right, Josh, excellent presentation. Thanks for pulling this together for tonight. Hopefully we'll have Adam back next week. And I think that's it.
Yep. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
All right, we're stopping the broadcast. Talk to you all next week. Bye.
Bye.